Hey, thank you, Adam. That was so kind. I have to say that Adam is probably the funniest person that I've ever met. Not the most talented, but the funniest for sure. But hi, everyone. It's such a joy and honor to be here with you all. Like Adam said, my husband and I, we moved to Detroit, Michigan a couple years ago. So we're so blessed to be here, especially because right now we're watching our Ring camera and our front yard is filling up with snow. So it's nice to be out here and enjoy the last bit of sunshine that we get for the next 4 months. But yeah, Adam and I, we've known each other almost 9 years now. We worked alongside each other as worship leaders, and I would love to say that I've come here with a bunch of fun and embarrassing stories about Adam, but you've probably heard them all already at this point, because we know telling embarrassing stories about himself is like his favorite pastime. But I had the realization that I bet Adam hasn't told you about an embarrassing story that we got to experience together that actually happens to be Christmas themed. So Merry Christmas, everybody. At the church that we worked at together, I was asked by someone organizing a Christmas party for our executive team and elders if I would play some Christmas songs on violin as background music as people were arriving, and maybe I could ask another worship leader to play guitar with me so it sounded a little fuller, so I asked Adam. And he said yes, and this is one of those stories that you can't really feel the level of awkwardness from me telling it right now, so I'm going to need you to try your best to paint the most uncomfortable scenario in your mind, and remember that Adam was there. And so we are playing some Christmas music, and it turns out, we figure out as everyone is walking in, that we were a surprise to everybody coming. But we were not the surprise that they wanted. And that was felt as they walked in and saw us and said, "Oh, hi, nice." And then immediately walked to the furthest room possible to get away from our music. So Adam and I were left alone in this room. We are dying laughing, powering through a couple more Christmas songs. I majorly butcher Let It Snow. I didn't play a single correct note. But there were no witnesses, so it didn't even matter. And we're not sure if we can technically leave at this point because there's nobody there. And then that next Monday, we come into work, and our boss, Lisa, is just deeply confused about why we were asked to do this party. And you know what? Us too. And I think everyone there was just confused about why we were there. To be clear, no one was rude to us. We just were not the surprise that they were hoping for. But I have heard that Adam is for hire, and he will play some Christmas songs at your Christmas party, so reach out to him about that. This was such an uncomfortable moment, but I can't help but look back at it and smile and laugh when that memory randomly comes back. I'll text Adam and Lisa about it, and we'll cringe together. And I think the reason it's a good memory worth laughing about is because I didn't have to go through it alone. If I was totally by myself, it would have probably only felt embarrassing and awkward, but because I had a friend there with me, it wasn't so bad. I wasn't actually left alone playing Christmas music in an empty room. And the comfort of not being alone is what this season is all about, that we celebrate every year. Christians of all different denominations and backgrounds all around the world recognize what we're doing right here, Advent. It's celebrating that Christ came, and is also the recognition that Christ is always coming, always entering into our broken world with hope. The name Emmanuel, God with us, comforts us with the promise that we are not alone. So today, as we begin this Advent season, Christians everywhere today are reflecting on what we just did, that Jesus arrived with hope. And your church is doing something so unique by contemplating on this phrase that we see in the Christmas story in Matthew chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. In the time of who? King Herod. This detail could seem insignificant to us as modern readers, but this tells us a lot about what the world was like when God joined his creation. Herod was the Roman-appointed ruler of Judea, a mostly Jewish region, so he was literally the king of the Jews. But because Herod was not Jewish, he craved legitimacy, and he even banished his first wife from his household to pursue a young Jewish girl named Mariamne, so that their children would have the legitimacy that he wanted to be king of the Jews. And I was watching a documentary on Herod that said that kings in this time would try to secure their legacy either by starting wars or building a bunch of stuff. And Herod went the building a bunch of stuff route. He was extremely rich, and that's an understatement. He built palaces and monuments, and for one of them, he built a man-made mountain that looks like this, and he built a palace on and into that mountain. It's incredible and innovative, these feats of human engineering. We still don't even know how all of this got done. And economically, there's mixed interpretations on whether Judea prospered during his reign or not, because these building projects, they did provide employment, but the people were also heavily taxed for what is dismissed as vanity projects to solidify his legacy, because Herod wanted to be remembered for his greatness. But towards the end of Herod's life, he became increasingly paranoid and violent towards those who he felt threatened his throne or were political rivals. Modern science suggests that his violence and paranoia could have been the result of kidney disease that literally drove him mad as they shrunk to half their size and poisoned his body. When I told my husband about that, he said, "Oh, like the Grinch." No, not quite. From his deathbed, he ruthlessly ordered the execution of students who, in an act of protest, took down a monument that he placed of a Roman eagle outside the Temple of Jerusalem that was placed by him there as a statement about Jerusalem's sovereignty under Rome. And then Herod also executed one of his wives and at least 3 of his own children. He was unhinged and violent. And the story that we're going to be in today in Matthew is what history arguably remembers Herod for the most, but it's the only record of this event happening. The Gospel of Luke doesn't mention it. Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote at length about King Herod, doesn't mention it either. But regardless of its historicity, Herod is remembered for his violence and cruelty towards the end of his life. The time of King Herod that Jesus was born into was a time of violence, a kingdom characterized by taking out rivals, building and hoarding wealth in alliance with Rome, their oppressor. So Matthew tells us that Jesus was born in the time of King Herod where? In Bethlehem of Judea. And Bethlehem is the location for one of Herod's 3 palaces that we just saw, the Herodium. That's that man-made mountain. Jesus is born next to this mountain and kingdom that epitomizes wealth, power, and comfort. But the Son of God arrives and is born in a sheep stall. A powerful image was taken 2 years ago outside of Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem of a baby Jesus laying on broken rocks and rubble that we see right here. And Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac on their Christmas service said that if Jesus was born today, this is where he'd be born, under the rubble in Gaza. Because Jesus was born among the marginalized and occupied under Rome, and today we still find the face of Christ in the most vulnerable places in our world. Advent is recognizing that Christ came and is still entering our broken world with hope now. So to consider what that phrase "in the time of King Herod" means for us today, and how we can identify parallels to our current reality as we hear what Herod and his kingdom was like is not hard. This is still a time where kings start wars and build monuments while people struggle, and the gap all around the world between the powerful and powerless is large, and it can look so dark and devoid of hope. But there is profound hope right there in that first sentence. In the time of King Herod, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So we're going to be in Matthew 2 today. If you like to follow along in your app or with your Bible, it'll also be on the screen. It says this: in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Magi here is often translated as wise men, and that also means astrologer. They've observed his star in the east, and they've come to pay homage to the child who has been born King of the Jews. This is speaking directly to Herod's deep insecurity that he has no royal blood, and he's not fully Jewish, and he is afraid of losing his power. And in the ancient world, people were looking up at the sky often with curiosity and wonder, because what they could see and conceptualize is the stars up there are moving and flowing almost like an ocean, and they did so in unison, except for what they could see were 7 stars. And before Jesus was born, like a century or so, the tilt of the earth changed. And this caused the stars in the sky that they were looking at to change. And noticing this, philosophers and astrologers recognize something big has happened that has changed everything in the sky. So this God has got to be really powerful in altering everything. So we have these astrologers, these pagans from the east. They've observed Jesus' star, and that has led them at the right time and moment to come seeking the birth of a new king. Popular theory is that Jupiter and Saturn were in conjunction with each other, and Jupiter was the royal planet, and Saturn was thought to represent the Jews. So in a really beautiful way, people looking up at the sky and coming up with this brand new belief system and religion about everything that was happening noticed something very, very true. God was changing everything. This time that they were in, God was coming into it and was at work speaking to these pagan astrologers, sending them dreams and inviting them to come and see Jesus. Because this is a message of hope for everybody. Jews, Gentiles, pagans, astrologers. God is rearranging the cosmos to draw all people to experience what the angels then declare as good news of great joy for all people. What's also interesting in this opening section is King Herod was frightened and all Jerusalem with him. Now, Jerusalem was the center of power religiously and politically, while Bethlehem was inhabited by the people at the margins, the poor, disenfranchised, like Mary and Joseph. So the all of Jerusalem that would have been frightened with King Herod would have been the elite and powerful, those who had something to lose if things changed with this new king. So then what happens next is Herod sends the Magi to Bethlehem and says, when they found him, to bring him word so that he too may go and pay the child homage. The wise men continue to follow the star. They find Jesus with Mary, give him gifts, and then God warns them in a dream not to return to Herod. And then it picks up here. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and mother by night, went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This is to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or younger, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. In the time of King Herod, Christ entered this world, a time of unjust, violent, vengeful kings that were holding on to their thrones and power and wealth, and Jesus came, born in a poor town, and threats of violence were made on his life as a child by a wicked king threatened by his arrival. And then for their safety, they had to flee to Egypt, so quite literally, Jesus is our refugee king. And many of us today, if we're honest, our circumstances are closer to living in Jerusalem with greater privilege and comfort than living with the poor and needy in Bethlehem. We might have been afraid in that time of what the arrival of what this kind of king would mean for our own comforts and privileges. And that's not a bad thing for us to be ashamed of, but it can actually invite us to consider how God is asking us to look towards the Bethlehems, where we see the face of Christ in the faces of those on the margins, to not turn our eyes away from injustice, but lean in and consider how God might be calling us to uniquely use our voice, to help, to give generously. And in this scene, Matthew describes an impoverished town of Bethlehem where the oppressive government invades and violently separates family, taking children from their parents, and the Son of God enters our world in a time of lament, loss, and inconsolable grief. And the time we're in right now, it is not literally the time of King Herod, but it is still the time of earthly rulers, earthly kingdoms and governments that at best disappoint us. And at worst, they do violence and harm to the most vulnerable. Every kingdom and every government will come to an end, and it is not made to last or for us to put our eternal hope in. We are meant here to notice in Matthew's writings that there are two different kingdoms clashing here, the Herods of our times and God's kingdom. So there's good news that in Advent, God comes to us with the hope of a better kingdom. Now, every gospel writer has their themes and the audience that they're writing to and how they're trying to uniquely illuminate Jesus. And Matthew really wanted his readers to know that with Jesus, the outsiders are in. For all of Herod's excessive wealth and exploitation, the Son of God aligns himself with the poor in the unglamorous conditions of a birth in a sheep's stall. So for all of Herod's violence, anger, retaliation, and paranoid protection of his throne, the Son of God, I love how the NLT in Philippians says it, gave up his divine privileges and became a servant. Jesus in his ministry tells parables describing what his kingdom is like. And he likens it to yeast in dough, that it's small and unseen, but it changes everything. That it's like a small mustard seed that grows into a tree and makes a home and place of refuge for birds and its branches when it's grown, just like how Jesus' kingdom expanded to welcome all people. And the people in Jesus' time, they were anticipating the arrival of a Messiah who would enact change and establish justice on earth. And Jesus teaches that the kingdom of God is manifest and radical love extended to everybody, even the love of your enemy. That Jesus' deeds of power were used not to punish or build monuments for himself, but cast out the powers of evil, to heal diseases, bring good news to the poor, bring light to darkness. And in Advent, God comes to us also with the hope of light in darkness. The Gospel of John speaks of Christ's arrival as a true light coming into the world. And all throughout John's Gospel, this contrast of light and darkness shows up as this key theme. That Jesus is the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overtake it, or other translations say cannot comprehend it. The physical light we can't see can't be overcome by darkness. And the mental, spiritual darkness we cannot see is also no match for the light. In just a couple weeks, we're approaching the winter solstice, and I think it's so profound that each year, just days before we celebrate Christ's arrival, we have winter solstice, the darkest day of the year. From summer solstice in June until now, we've felt the days get shorter and shorter. It gets darker earlier. The sun rises later. And this happens every year, but I don't know about you. Every year, I find myself saying, wow, I can't believe how early it's getting dark. No matter how many years I go through it, it just never feels right, does it, that the sun sets before 5 p.m.? It's like unfair. And I think the darkness just seems to take us by surprise every year. The physical darkness of the rising and setting sun, and also the darkness of war, greed, loss, poverty, sickness. We are quite literally in the time of darkness, but at winter solstice, we get to experience the promise that God has woven into the laws of nature. It will not get any darker than this. Light will slowly return. The sun will remain a little longer. Darkness will not fully swallow the light. Because light shines in the darkness, and darkness can't comprehend it. Herod's reign will not be forever. Hold on, light will come. And in the Gospel of Matthew, just 2 chapters after what we read earlier, he quotes the prophet Isaiah using the same word for light that John does, as he says that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who have sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. Light has dawned to those sitting in the shadow and places of death, and Jesus is this great light dawning. I love the connection of John's word saying that the light shines in the darkness, and to Matthew saying that, and Isaiah is acknowledging that this light has arrived to a people sitting in darkness. Light is directed somewhere, it shines somewhere, and here we see that God's intent is that his light is directed at us. Us who feel like we're sitting in darkness, this light is dawning for us. And New Testament writers would speak of darkness and light metaphorically describing moral darkness in the absence of divine light, and then the coming of light symbolized the presence of God, his goodness and truth, shalom. And darkness was associated with evil, violence, suffering. So here, Matthew is identifying Jesus as the light that has arrived. You can see Matthew's contrast of Herod and Jesus continuing here, that if Jesus is the light that has arrived, it is in the time of the darkness of Herod's rule. Because light illuminates, light sees what's been hidden in darkness, and this is what we see in the life and ministry in Jesus. He moved towards the unseen with compassion and welcome, the excluded ones, those who went unnoticed, untouched, unseen. Light shone on them. They were seen by the incarnate God in the midst of the darkness they were sitting in. And there's another word that stood out to me that both Gospels of John and Matthew use, where Matthew says, a people sat in darkness have seen a great light. It could literally be translated, a people dwelling in darkness. And then a few verses later in John 1, he said, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, his dwelling. Both of these passages illuminating the hope of the incarnation draw this parallel that we as humanity have been dwelling, living in darkness, but Jesus made his dwelling, made his living with us, bringing light to the darkness we've been living in. And the Greek word for flesh here refers to a human body, and also in the ancient world, flesh was associated with mortality and weakness, and all of what is wrapped up in what it means to exist as a human with the limitations of being human. Needing to sleep, eat, our health wavering, our bodies aching. The incarnate Christ shows us a God who took on human form, entered the time of King Herod, and experienced the same struggles of being human that we do. In the time of King Herod, in the time of darkness, there is good news and hope that God comes to us because he refuses to be distant from us. The phrase made his dwelling among us can also be translated as tabernacled among us, referencing God's presence among his people in the Old Testament in the tabernacle, that moving tent as they made their exodus from Egypt. And this was a physical manifestation of God's presence with his people. And then in the New Testament, it now describes the incarnation of Christ and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. God is continuing to dwell with his people. Now, I want to propose a question for us to just think about and ponder together this morning. If humankind had not sinned, do you think that Christ would have still become human with us? Do you think Christ would have still become human with us? Really, just think about that for a moment. This is something that's been debated for ages among Christians, so I'm not going to answer this. No one has or can give a definitive answer, but I think it's really healthy for us to practice a thoughtful faith where we wonder about these things that we don't have a clear answer to. Because God is never going to be fully figured out by humans, so we wonder. And so much of Advent is practicing wonder as a community. Now, St. Maximus the Confessor was a 6th century Christian monk and theologian who believed that, yes, Christ still would have come, regardless of the fall and sin entering the world, because he believed that the purpose of the entire creation was for the incarnation of Christ. That it was not God's reaction to the fall of humankind, but the plan of God that pre-existed the ages as a movement of a creator wishing to unite creation with himself. That God wishes to share his divine life by being hypostatically united to humans. I'm not saying that this is the theology you need to believe today, but it's something really interesting to consider and wonder about. Because the Apostle Paul says God's mysterious will is to unite all things to himself, and that had been decided before the foundation of the world. That in love God created, and in love God joined his creation, putting on human flesh, choosing the weakness and frailty of being human. So personally, I don't see anything in God's character pointing to a God who intended to be distant from his creation. God chose to be with us at every point in the story. So to celebrate Advent is to celebrate that this wasn't a one-time transaction when Christ became human, but the promise that Christ is always coming into our broken world to be with us. And this reality is made manifest in the arrival of Jesus into the turbulent time of King Herod. In Jesus finding solidarity in his birth with the poor and marginalized and being our refugee king. That he's well acquainted with the realities of what it is like to live in times like ours, and where he placed himself and chose to be identified was not God in the Herodium or God in the palaces, but God with us. God with us, born in the shadows and the valley eclipsed by the shadow of the Herodium, illuminated then by the stars that drew pagan astrologers to come and see this God who was changing everything by joining his creation. So the incarnation of Christ reveals to us the absolute refusal of God being distant from us. And with that same Spirit of God with us, God close to us, we practice that with one another, with our neighbors. Almost 2 years ago, I went through some intense trauma therapy called prolonged exposure therapy. If you're familiar with EMDR, it's a little bit like that. And what it looks like at a very high level view is reliving your traumatic event in therapy sessions every week and then listening to the recording of your retelling multiple times a day, plus slowly exposing yourself to something that you've avoided as a result of your trauma to teach your brain that you're safe now and there's no active threat. And without getting into all of the details of it, there was one to do towards the end of my therapy that felt really scary to me, and it involved a place that I had to go to. And one of my best friends in Detroit was aware of this therapy I was going through and was a person of support for me throughout it. And I told her about this thing on my list and where I needed to go and how scared I was. And without hesitation, she said, "I'll come with you. I'll drive you." And she drove with me. And she sat with me. And she didn't understand what was going on in my heart or brain. She didn't ask invasive questions. She was just with me. And through that simple act of presence, I saw the promise that, yes, God is with me. God is with me through her friendship. And we don't have to be alone, and we're not meant to live in darkness. And to us, dwelling in the time of King Herod's and the time of darkness, a great light has shone with hope, joy, peace, and love. And this great light made his dwelling among us, and now this is who we are to be for one another. So today, ask yourself, what hope is God wanting to meet you with? Maybe it's with the hope of an incarnate God whose kingdoms contrast all the disappointment and corruption of earthly kingdoms and rulers across our world, across all time and history. The hope that there is a better way and kingdom worth giving our allegiance to. Because did you know that most empires are believed to last about 250 years or so, and America turns 250 next year? I'm not saying it's time to bunker up or anything, but that should give us some sort of sobering feeling that this kingdom that we are living in right now is not worthy of our eternal hope or allegiance. Only the kingdom of heaven is worthy of that. And maybe God is meeting you with hope in your personal darkness today. Maybe the darkness you've been walking in and carrying and has felt too much. And a friend of mine has always said something profound, that when we are afraid of the dark, it's not because we're afraid we're alone, it's because we're afraid we're not alone. So it matters who is with us in the dark. So what hope, what comfort, what joy that in all darkness that we sit in, we get Jesus there with us. And perhaps as God has refused to be distant from you, he is inviting you to be that for someone. To practice the withness that we experience in God with us. God not distant, God not far away or unconcerned, but with us. Because in the time of King Herod's, Christ came and made his dwelling among us. To a people walking in darkness, we have seen a great light. Let's pray. Jesus, we receive your hope this morning. God, in the complexity of the time that we are living in, maybe in the hopelessness that we are carrying individually and collectively, God, we thank you that you meet us there with a promise that you are not distant. At no point did you intend to be distant from your creation. We thank you for that. We thank you for the way that we see that in your incarnation, that you chose to be human with us in the most humble place possible. Jesus, we love you and we receive your hope. Amen.